Um, so Laura, I'm just really happy to have you for Systems in Action. I was so excited that you agreed to speak, and of course your topic today on leadership is like something that I live every day and am looking at. But if you will, would you give us a little bit about your background? I think you can probably describe it a little bit better than I could read it, and it might be a little bit more entertaining. If so, just give us a little bit about where you've been and how you've gotten to this point.
Yes, well, it hasn't been a direct A to B route. I started in college really interested in social policies, public policy, how they affect families and children. I sort of segue from that. I mean, I sort of kept that as my base and then moved into really wanting to understand research methods, assessment, how we really can tell that we're making a difference in people's lives through different interventions and efforts. So I spent, all of my time at Cornell sort of doing those things and finished my PhD. And right at the end of my PhD, I crossed paths with a full-on systems thinker and systems theorist and started to understand through a grant that we were working on together for NSF, really the power of this new way of thinking about things and systems thinking as a concept and as a tool and as a method, and how it could really change and almost sort of give teeth to the things I had been studying for so long in terms of, understanding policy and systems that appeared really complicated but were actually fairly complex. And so, that sort of kept me on my sort of policy base, but I sort of started to see things as systems and segued into really having an interest in not only systems thinking as a concept, but how we could really deconstruct it, understand it, and teach it. Because it was really a remarkable thing for me to learn it. And I thought if, I would like to really be able to, so I have a background in translational research. And I thought I would really love to work with then my partner in crime, how to really translate and teach and get people to really understand systems thinking at its core. And so that's when Derek and I started working in schools, kindergarten through grade 12, loved kindergartners. They learned it all really quickly, which then led us to believe, how can we make it so that everybody can learn as fast as a kindergartner? So that's sort of how my path with systems thinking and now Cabrera Research Lab in Cornell has landed, is my own application of it, and then feeling like it was almost a responsibility to figure out how everyone else could learn it, because it really changed how I thought about things. That's sort of the nutshell of it, yeah.
Great. I mean, you've had a very interesting path, and and we're living in such a chaotic world, and especially in organizations or anywhere leaders show up. Leaders show up on the streets. I mean, it's not just in organizations. And how do we somehow put that chaos in perspective so that it's not overwhelming, and that we can deal with it. So I'm looking forward to your presentation, and just let me remind everybody that's on the call, put your questions in the Q&A box or either in the chat box, and we will make you a panelist and you can ask your own questions. So I just wanted to do that. Okay, thanks, Laura. Go ahead and get started.
Well, thanks, and thanks for having me. I'm actually excited to be here. I was fortunate enough to see the registration list. I saw some familiar names and not familiar names, so I'm happy always to meet and talk to new people about these ideas. So we're going to talk about the simple rules of systems leadership today. And my hope is to really, in not more than 45 minutes or so, answer three main questions. Why systems leadership? What is systems leadership? And how do you do systems thinking and leadership in organizations? And if you think about it, we have two courses that we teach at Cornell, and they're based on two texts. And today we're going to talk about the top end of that pyramid, which is from our book, Flock Not Clock, which really talks about how we leverage systems thinking inside of organizations to affect the outcomes we're seeking. So the way to look at this pyramid is that systems thinking at the individual level rolls up into the organizational level and sort of gives us some central tenets of systems leadership. And these are the two areas that Derek and I work on at Cabrera Research Lab, in addition to sort of systems mapping. So this audience is going to get a 13-week course in 44 minutes, and I have every confidence that you're all up to the task. So it's going to be fun. So as I said, we're going to deal with the organizational level, how we can leverage these systems thinking skills in organizations. And a few of you, or some of you, may have had the opportunity to hear Derek did a presentation with the same group with Deanna about systems thinking. And he talked a lot about systems thinking as a complex adaptive system that had within it 4 simple rules: distinction, systems, relationships, and perspectives, and that the emergent property of those rules is, you know, an adaptive thinker who can really solve problems and is a systems thinker. And much like this, we have 4 simple rules of organizations with the agents within an organization are the people, and there are 4 sort of natural functions of systems, which are vision, mission, capacity, and learning. And when those things are applied over and over again, the emergent property is an adaptive organization, almost a super organism that can sort of turn on a dime with very little effort. And the thing that's important is every organization, your organization, is a CAS, because by nature, because all human organizations are complex adaptive systems. So you don't get to choose whether or not it's a complex adaptive system. It just is. But what you do get to choose is whether your mental models of your organization are in alignment with the reality of your organization as it exists. And the important thing is what you get from making this choice is the benefits of an adaptive organization that learns and changes with its environment. And what we want to do is we want to sort of contrast where we've been to where we want to be. So let's think about our traditional mental models of organizations and how they work, and remember that they're deeply ingrained in us even today. And today we sort of, the traditional mental model used to be a clockwork, that an organization was like a clock. And it was highly influenced by the work of Frederick Taylor, who had great research, and he, you know, came up with the scientific application of the 21-pound shovel. And Taylorism was really, really influential, and it led to really great efficiencies in managing factories. But in today's world, which is competitive and which is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, we know that efficiencies, they're just not enough. And what we need to have is more of an adaptive organization that's quick and agile in its response to changes in the market. So this clockwork metaphor from before has had, and it still has, a significant impact on how we think about organizations. And we can, and it can be described by its components, which are basically a set of mental models that are still seen in organizations today. And make no mistake, these old mental models are still impacting your culture and the potential impact of your organization. So let's talk about that. So the first of them is the concept of planning. The second is the idea of command. The third is the concept of control. And the final is this notion of utilize or utilization. And all of these work reasonably well because they make us actually feel like we're in control of the process or the processes we're using until we get the results. And then we start to question these faulty mental models about our organization. So we need to really pick apart at them and look at them a little bit more in depth. So when we think about planning, we like to plan, we have strategic plans. Those of us who are over the age of 35 know that we used to have like 10-year plans, then it went to 5-year plans, then we've moved down to just quarterly goals and so forth and so forth. But we need to think a little bit differently about planning, because what we know is that what we plan for is not always what happens. And over the years, as the complexity of the world around us has changed, the horizon for planning has necessarily shrunk substantially from 10 to 5 to 3 years to less than a year. And now I think many organizations are literally just working quarter to quarter because they know that things are so uncertain. So we like to feel in command, and the simplicity of this mental model, it comforts us. We like the idea that command as a function is simple, it just trickles down, and it's just executed optimally. This is, though, what really is happening in organizations. And it's a funny slide if you take a minute to read some of the various types of relationships that we see happening in a traditional workplace. But the real point is that there are networks within organizations of formal and informal relationships inside of organizations, and that these relationships exist and they don't necessarily adhere to this hierarchical tree. And what's really important is that we recognize that people exist in these influential networks with certain nodes in that network having more influence than others, and that this is the reality of how our organizations are structured. We need to recognize this as reality so that we can start to better understand how to leverage those relationships within our networks, within the organization. Does that make sense? Yes, I see Deanna saying yes.
Yes, yes, it does make sense. And you're getting a lot of comments that it makes sense to several on the call too, so.
Oh, good. And so you can almost say that we're in love with this idea of this really sort of static hierarchical mental model. We love it so much that we've decided that we will use it as well to manage our organizational processes. And we are so smart that we do this by simply turning it on its side. And there you have it. It's now a flow chart, a Gantt chart, a workflow chart. And these are things that people also hold very near and dear to their heart in organizations. But here's the thing, we need to think a little bit differently also about our processes and our need for control. And we need to think about what effective reality-based processes would look like. And there are three things that I think are required for these processes to be more effective. The first is you have to have brutal honesty about your starting point. And you need to be really data-driven about where you are in that moment. The second thing is you need to have clarity in your ending point, your vision or your goal, because it's leaders that stand sort of in the future and they describe what they see, what that future is that they're hoping to bring about. And the third thing, which is really important, is you have to have flexibility and adaptivity in how you get there. And that requires knowing the simple rules that underlie your work. And finally, the traditional, and I would argue still somewhat contemporary mental model of organizations sees humans as resources to be utilized or squeezed for all of their value to serve the organization. But we now know that organizations are starting to move away from this sort of traditional HR model towards a mental model of talent management. And talent management is a little bit less of a utilization paradigm and more of a developmental, incentives-based, motivational approach to managing people. So either way, the goal for managing humans is to leverage the relationships among them to create an agile superorganism that can adapt when it's necessary. And that's usually the result of external forces to the organization, that adaptation becomes necessary. So if we contrast these two sets of ideas, what you see is a traditional organizational model actually works against the natural tendencies of the system and often will lead to muted or unsatisfactory results. But if you leverage the natural tendencies of a complex system via simple rules, this better aligns how we think our organization works with how it actually works. And then we can have a greater effect on the outcomes we seek. So VMCL, which is the model I'm going to talk about today, replaces this sort of clockwork approach to organizations with a more systemic approach, which is based on complex adaptive systems. And the insights I offer you, I'm going to try to offer you today about VMCL, I'm hoping will help you move towards a more reality-based, natural view of your organization, away from that mechanistic clock-like metaphor to more of a biological or flock-like metaphor of an organization. So VMCL has four simple rules, four critical parts, which are vision, which is the desired future state or goal; mission, which are the actions that are done repeatedly that will lead to your vision over time. Then there's capacity, which are all of the organizational systems that support your vision and, sort of indirectly also your vision. And then learning, which is the continual modification of your mental models based on feedback that's coming in from the external environment. And we're also going to spend some time on that last piece, which is the underlying foundation of culture. And we'll also talk a little bit about the critical relationships between and among the parts in the model. And one of the more important parts is we need to pay attention to the alignment between and among these components, because this model relies on creating strong bonds between a vision and a mission, the capacital systems in the mission, and the learning function feeding into the capacity. And as I said, culture sits at the base of the functions. And so we're going to also talk about how to focus your efforts on building a culture around these 4 functions and the shared mental models you're going to need to build to drive organizational behavior to where you want it to go. So let's talk a little bit about each of these separately, and then we'll tie them together towards the end. So just as a quick note, the book that I was talking about, we do have a checklist which sort of walks people through creating their own visions and missions and set up their systems and things like that. So that's something that leaders often find very useful. Now let's talk about vision. There are 5 things that are important about vision. It has to depict the desired future state. It has to be intrinsically motivating. It should be short and simple. It must be measurable. And importantly, it has to live in the hearts and minds of the agents within the system. It can't just be a picture up on a wall or a statement on a website. It has to actually be indoctrinated into the agents in the system. 2 things about vision that are important. It is a natural function of any organization, whether it's purposefully designed or articulated by a leader. In other words, a system always has a purpose in and of itself. It's up to a leader whether or not they want to shape that and articulate it in a particular way towards a vision. And it's a core tenet of your culture that has to be shared. So even in a system where no explicit vision has been stated, it does have a goal state, which will be driven by its members and needs to be, because of, possibly the purpose of a system is what it does. It is a central tenet of organizations that we have to pay attention to. The other thing that's important is if an organization naturally starts to have 2 or more visions, it becomes effectively visionless. If you think about it like these 2 guys in this canoe, if these 2 guys each have an individual vision and they're working towards that, then the organization vision is the combination of them, which in effect cancels themselves out. So they're not going to get very far, obviously. They're going to go in circles, if anywhere at all. And when we talk about a vision being short and simple, one of the ways we might get those 2 guys on the canoe on board is to articulate something that's simple and easy to understand. Derek and I also, often call it the 9-year-old test. So if you look at these examples, it's not important that you can read them fully, but just look at the size of those statements. And you ask yourself, how likely is it that you can get an entire organization to understand and know the vision and mission on the right versus the 2 on the left? And so that's why we always say it needs to be short and simple, because people need to be able to understand it, build a shared mental model about it, and be able to articulate it back to others in the organization. And when we say that your vision must be intrinsically motivating, it's important that you communicate your vision, because your vision will affect your employees and therefore your organization. And this is backed by a lot of research into organizations. So for example, this Gallup poll tracked levels of employee engagement and reported that disengaged employees outnumber engaged employees by about 2 to 1. Also, in a recent quality of life at work survey, what they found was that employees who found more meaning in their work were 93% more engaged with their daily work. They were almost 3 times more likely to stay with their company, and they were twice as satisfied with their jobs. And the authors of that study concluded that no single factor in their study influenced people's job satisfaction and likelihood to stay at an organization as much as finding a sense of meaning and purpose in their work. So what we know is engaged employees have a huge effect within organizations. So for example, engaged employees are 50% more productive, 33% more profitable, and they're responsible for 56% higher customer loyalty scores, and they're associated with 44% higher retention rates. And these factors, when you combine them together, they will produce significant long-term gains for any organization. And this is why we say that our vision has to be short, simple, and it has to be measurable, and it has to be motivating. And here's an example of a vision and mission statement that we saw one day when we were out on the road. So at the same time that there's this abundance of research that shows that vision and mission are highly correlated with performance and success, there's a whole nother body of research that shows how confused we are about what constitutes a vision and a mission. And the most likely point of confusion is that we tend to conflate the two ideas, vision and mission. And this example makes us laugh, and it's consistent with this research that people are actually confusing vision and mission. Because if you look at this poster, in the case where they say their vision is that they will be, but their mission is stated as that they already are, how is that going to guide anybody's work? And how is that not going to confuse people and every day as they sit down and start to work towards a vision that they can't understand based on how it's articulated? So if we talk about mission is similar to vision in some ways, but mission is something that we do repeatedly. It's the actions we do on a daily basis to try to work towards a vision. It over time brings about the vision. Our mission statement should explain who's doing what for whom. It needs to be clear and concise and easily understood, just like a vision is short and simple. It also is equally important that it's measurable, like a vision has to be measurable. It must live in the hearts and minds of people in the organization. And the other thing about this, a mission, is when you get the opportunity to actually do your mission, the moments where you're actually interacting with a customer or a client or whoever it is that you're trying to affect, those moments should be considered to be precious. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. And so there's been a lot of work on and a lot of research on corporate missions. And when you do sort of a meta-analysis across this research, what you'll see is the study of missions is plagued by this sort of lack of consensus on or clarity about what a good mission could contain. One study that described these 23 years of research on definitions of mission statements showed a wide variance of how people think about mission. And what this table shows is the author's summary of the content of mission statements from key works on the subject. And after reviewing all of this research, what the authors concluded was that there appears to be virtually no consensus as to what mission statements should or should not include. So we know that we need to try to recapture or come up with a way to make it so that we can not only distinguish vision and mission from each other, but also what are the necessary components to a good mission statement that will really guide people's work. And so if you take a wider look at organizations, not just as a noun, but the concept of organization as a verb across natural and social systems, what you see is not just a human-based definition of mission, but sort of a feature of organization itself. And this is why we say the MCL are functions of all forms of organization, and that ranges from organs to organism to organizations. And when we talk about a good mission statement, this is sort of like, I don't know, some of you might remember Mad Libs, those things where you filled in the words and they became funny sentences and your children think they're still hilarious today, which is great. One of the few things that have gone from generation to generation. So this is sort of the mission statement Mad Lib. And a good mission statement will explain who's doing what for whom, and when it's done repeatedly, it will lead to your vision. So let me give you a couple of quick examples of this. So here's a really simple vision and mission, right? And I'm not advocating any particular religion at all, but if, say, for example, your vision was a Catholic world, well, then your mission is very simple. You need to simply go out every day and convert the unconverted. So for example, I go to person A and I say, hey, are you a Catholic? And they say, yes. I don't have any work to do there because they've already been converted. I go to person B, they're not, and they say, oh, here's where my work comes in. And now I try to convert that person into that religion. And here's sort of what we call the granddaddy of the best visions and missions, simple vision and mission, which is if the vision is resilient biodiversity, then the mission is sort of already programmed into every organism, such that they know that in order for that to be happening, all they have to do is go forth and multiply. It's very simple. And you can see that they're coupled in that if those missions are done over and over and over again, the emergent property of that will be the visions as they're stated. And here's another example that's maybe a slightly more serious in some ways. So General George Casey, he's sort of a natural born systems thinker, and he came up with this great clear mission, which is clear, hold, build. And what he said about it was, it's essential to distill a message into a few key points and hone its delivery. Clear communication is like sharpening a pencil. You slowly remove the unnecessary until you're left with a pointed, useful message. And after trying and failing to communicate our strategy, we went back to the drawing board and came up with clear, hold, build, and recommunicated, and it was much better understood. So that's a great mission. And what's really interesting about this particular mission is they were sort of General Casey's 3 simple rules. And the great thing about them is they were able to be applied at multiple levels of scale in his efforts. So for example, a platoon of soldiers applied the mission to clear a house of dangers, set up security measures to hold that house, and then needed to build relationships in that house to ensure longer term success of their efforts. And then this applied at every level of scale upwards, from neighborhoods to towns to regions to eventually state. And so what he understood is that systems thinking isn't just something that generals do to get the big picture. It's something that all of the agents, the soldiers and the commanders, had to do at every level in the organization. And all he needed to do was help all the agents identify the simple rules that collectively led to the emergent property that they were seeking. And that's why he was so successful. And if you remember also, I had mentioned that missions must be measurable. And here's an example of how we could set some metrics for the 3 simple ideas of his mission. And you can see that all we have to do is sort of track the number of things we're clearing, how long we can hold things, the types of relationships we're building. And so we can see that we're actually accomplishing that mission through measurement. And that's an important tenet that we need to remember. And the other thing that I had said earlier is that we want to make sure that vision and missions don't live in frames or live in frames or are posted in websites, but they really are something that are sort of indoctrinated or really held in the hearts and minds of everyone in their organization. And part of the reason that's important is because we also said they need to be intrinsically motivating. So we want all of our employees or whoever it is that we're talking about to wake up excited to work towards our vision through our mission. And we want that to be intrinsically motivating. We don't want to have to constantly be sort of extrinsically motivating people. That's not how that's not a healthy way to do it. And then also, if you remember, we talked a little bit about mission moments. And when I talk about mission moments being precious, what we mean is that, if you have clients or customers that you need to deal with, when you have the opportunity to interact with them, it has to be treated as a precious moment, because if you do that mission moment well, you're going to get more of them. But if that mission moment goes poorly, you'll get fewer of them. And a restaurant is a great example of this. So you can think about now it's a long time ago since we ate in restaurants, but if you think about the last time you were in a restaurant, probably 5 or 6 months ago, you know that if something wasn't right, with your meal, or if the restaurant was not clean, or the waiter was obnoxious, or whatever it was, if that mission moment for that restaurant with you as a customer didn't go well, you're not going to go back. And so they're going to have fewer and fewer opportunities to execute their mission, which means they're not going to get to their vision for their restaurant. And so when we move from vision and mission, now we talk about capacity. If you think about it, as vision is sort of what you see and mission is what you do, then we need to think about capacity as the state of readiness of your organization to do your mission. And we also need to recognize that it's a system of systems. And we often will, as we talked about workflow processes and Gantt charts and things, we also will map our capacity frequently to understand or better design our systems to be better at doing our mission. And we also need to remember that we have to have a learning function in our organization to expand our capacity. Purposefully have a learning function to expand our capacity. And so when I say it's a system of systems, what I mean, it has to be tied to your mission. Meaning if there are systems that are not serving your mission, then you need to think about why they exist in the first place, because we really want to laser focus on being able to execute the mission of the organization. And we don't want redundancy within a system. We don't want two systems that are doing the same thing. We don't want a bunch, if you see on the right side of that chart, you don't want just a bunch of disconnected systems. That's how we get to things like silos and a lack of organizational communication, which slows us down and makes us less effective in doing our work. And if you think back to that mission moment in the restaurant, you have to remember that that moment where a customer is sitting down to eat, in this case, a burger and fries, there's a lot of capacital systems behind it. So in a restaurant, you have to think about all the capacital systems that have to be in place to ensure that that customer has the best experience. So there's the cleaning crew, the launderer, there's the back-end systems of the financial systems that create the chef's ability to buy the best ingredients, and then there's the chefs themselves. And it's all of those systems are solely designed to maximize that diner's experience, which is the mission moment, and then hopefully gain more customers. And in a more sort of complex example, many people have talked about that once you sort of have articulated your vision and mission, and if it's as complicated as sort of the stability in Afghanistan, it really helps to map it out, to better understand the systems, and to be certain that all of those systems are building capacity to do your mission daily. So when you're thinking about capacity, there are three things that you should think about. One is think about a capacital system in your organization and ask yourself, how is that system providing capacity for me to do my mission? And then once you've answered that, you need to identify where your mission moments are happening and figure out how the success of those moments can be measured. And if you think about capacity has to have within it a very purposeful learning function. And so, Jack Welch said famously, an organization's ability to learn and translate that learning into action rapidly is the ultimate competitive advantage. And that is the driver of an adaptive organization, that concept that in order to be competitive, to adapt to external forces, we have to be constantly learning, which means we have to constantly be seeking feedback from the external environment and taking that feedback in to change and modify our systems to be more on point to our mission, which will eventually lead to the vision. So when we talk about learning, there are three primary things we think about in terms of learning. First, we have to harness the power of mental models. The second is we have to train people to think in order to learn, which seems obvious. And it is obvious, but it's also something we have to really take to heart, that we have to focus on how people are thinking things through and how they learn the different things we need to teach them to be more effective within an organization. And then we also need to recognize that in order to be responsive, we have to constantly evolve our mental models when we receive feedback, either inside or outside of our system. So, hold on, there we go. So the next question is, how do we create adaptive learning organizations? So let's start with harnessing the power of mental models. So how do we harness the power of mental models and train people to think? This is something that we've been working on a long time and thinking about. And let's start first by seeing the connection among individual learning, building mental models, and organizational and collaborative learning, which you can see here in the top part of the pyramid. And what you see is when you have clarity of your vision and mission, that will lead to more clarity where most of the work actually happens, which is in your capacity and learning system, in your organizational capacity and your organizational learning. And this will all lead to the knowledge of an organization at any given time, or a knowledge base. And so we have to focus first, if you look at that bottom level of the top, organizational learning, which is about mental models and how we share changes in mental models. So we're going to focus on mental models. And I'm sure this audience has seen this slide before. This is a pretty well-known slide. So when you think about this sort of metaphor of the iceberg, what systems thinking is doing is, at a fundamental level, it's telling us to look deeper beyond the surface features of a problem or an issue or something that's happening, and look at how the world works and how we think. And if we think of it as this iceberg, then there's more to it than meets the eye. Say you or your organization are the boat. Hopefully it's not, it kind of looks like the Titanic, but let's pretend it's not the Titanic. And so what we would say is, we want you to look beyond that surface level and not just react to events. Because if that's all you can see if all you can see is what's happening at the surface, all you're really going to be able to do is react. But if you go underneath that and you start to look at systemic patterns, or, in other words, the repetition of events over time, then you can start to be more predictive. And this gives you more, sometimes even just seconds, minutes, days, or weeks to respond to an issue rather than an off-the-cuff reaction. If you go even deeper under that and you see system structure, and we all know the popular saying about systems thinking is system structure determines behavior, then what that means is the way systems are organized will actually determine the behavior. And if we see these underlying system structures, then we can start to design those structures to bring about the behavior that we are actually looking for, or the desired behavior that we're seeking. And then if you look even beneath sort of system structures, and we think about sort of more of the research in neuroscience and cognition, for a while we didn't really understand how mental models were built. And we didn't know how either to align those mental models with how the real world system structures were working. So when we see that there's this sort of underlying cognitive code that allows us to understand how we're structuring our mental models, then we can transform how we frame, design, or predict, or react to things, because we can see what the root cause is, or the root issue is, that how we're thinking about it in the first place. So one of the most important cultural shifts that you can make in an organization is to move away from this kind of mentality of this is the way things are, to this is our mental model of how things are. So one of the things we think about with learning is that we need to introduce this concept, the reality of mental models, the fact that we are literally experiencing reality through our mental models, almost as a lens. We also have to sort of develop a common language about mental models. Then we have to build some skills in how we build them, share them, and evolve mental models to exhibit or demonstrate learning. And often in organizations, we can also use technology to help support those functions. And, we've often said that, these wicked problems are the result from that mismatch between how we think things are working and how they're actually working in real world systems. And it's that mismatch that we need to acknowledge, and then work to align how we're thinking about something, our mental models of something, and how it's existing in reality. And the only way to do that is through a purposeful feedback loop that we need to create as organizational leaders or organizational members. So back to this slide that we had in the beginning, this is a real world example of a mismatch that happens in modern organizations, because we think that the system works like that clean cut hierarchical tree at the top of the slide, but really the truth is it's existing in a far more interesting and dynamic network of relationships between and among the people that causes us not to adhere to the clean model at the top. And what's important, as I said earlier, is that we recognize that fact, because that can change how we influence and use those relationships to better bring about what we're trying to do. And simply put, and we've probably showed this a lot, but simply put, we need to recognize not only that we have mental models, we need to really take it to heart that our mental models are just approximations of the real world, and we need to purposefully seek out feedback in the form of information from the real world, which will feed back into modifying our mental models. And that's how, over time, going through that cycle over and over again, our mental models become better aligned, which means our decisions are more effective, our innovations are more useful, et cetera, because we're acting more and more closely to the reality of how things are. Notice also that when we talk about building a mental model, there are two components in a mental model, which is the information and the thinking. And so when we structure information, we bring it meaning. The mental model, which is M, or knowledge or meaning, however you want to think about it, is the result of structuring any information or data through thinking. And we think of thinking as making distinctions, organizing things into systems, recognizing relationships, and taking perspectives. So that's what the thinking part is comprised of. So when we say we train people to think in order to learn, this is what we're talking about. So, Derek and I started our lab many years ago. It gets many and many more as I realize that time is fast. Time is moving fast. Once you hit a certain place, it goes faster. And so, as I said earlier when I was talking in the beginning, that we really think systems thinking is relevant and useful to everyone, both personally and professionally. And we've been really fortunate to be able to teach these systems thinking, these ideas in many different contexts, from K-12 schools to graduate schools, Cornell, Silicon Valley companies, federal government agencies, nonprofits, and also we've been doing a lot of work recently with the military at West Point, the military academy. And, we've learned a lot from being able to try to teach these same things across many contexts. But there are two things that I think have been really important that we've learned along the way. The first is that learning to be a systems thinker really involves almost unlearning deeply ingrained habits of thinking. And what we find is many people have trouble sort of escaping the shackles of a lifetime of sort of implicit or explicit reliance on sort of what we consider traditional thought styles like linear and binary thinking, that we're sort of trained into linear and binary thinking, even though we don't naturally exist as only linear and binary thinkers. And what's interesting, and as I alluded to earlier, is given sort of the sophistication and application at the highest levels of research, analysis, and sort of problem solving, systems thinking is actually sort of ironically easier to teach to preschool and elementary students. They learn it with far greater ease because they haven't had their natural tendency to think systemically dulled over the years through this logic that's been taught in traditional education. So systems thinking, or DSRP, is sort of a new paradigm of thinking. It's more of a multivalent form of logic, and it encourages us to see sort of webs of causality and to think beyond the binary and beyond just simple cause and effect. And one of the things we have to do is we need to expand our ways of thinking and practice it, because that's how we will rewire our neuronal pathways to take into account multivalency and the non-linearity that exists in systems today. So it's literally trying to unlearn and undo that sort of what's become almost ingrained in us, lock-in of sort of linear and binary ways of thinking. And the second thing that we've learned is not just the importance of communicating to people that we all already use the rules of cognition. We're all already making distinctions. We're all already organizing ideas into systems. We're seeing relationships, and without always being conscious of it, we're taking at least one perspective, if not many perspectives, to understand ideas. And so we really think one of the short-term solutions is to practice thinking about your own thinking, and over time developing that metacognitive awareness of how you're bringing meaning to your information, how you're building ideas. And so when we talk about training people to think in order to learn, we're talking about really applying systems thinking and DSRP to any problems or situations that somebody's thinking about. So let me just talk about these for a few minutes in case you haven't become familiar with DSRP, because it's a part of our learning component. So basically, it's 4 simple things: distinctions, systems, relationships, and perspectives. Each one of those 4 things has 2 elements to it. And in those things, the one element is always implying the other and vice versa. So in distinctions, the 2 co-implying elements of making distinctions are identity and other, meaning we're always identifying ideas or things and then distinguishing them from other things or ideas. And it simply involves, distinction making just involves drawing boundaries, which is an essential practice of systems thinking. The systems rule is fairly simple. It's part and whole, and the elements, part and whole are the 2 elements of the rule, meaning you can't have parts without wholes and wholes without parts. We're constantly organizing ideas into systems of parts and wholes, or we're working with ideas in the way that others have organized them for us. And systems thinkers will often focus on defining the system and setting the boundaries, and then making sure that the parts are organized in a very particular way based on their understanding. And it's really important to be aware that anything can simultaneously be a part and a whole. That's an important sort of understanding of systems thinking. And then if you move into the relationships rule, the 2 elements of relationships are action and reaction. And we don't get far in understanding systems without understanding that parts are interrelated. The relationships can be direct or indirect, correlational or causal. They can be feedback loops. And we know that anything can be related to other things, or it could be the relationship between things. And the perspectives rule is that any idea can be a point or a view of perspective. So there's the seer and the thing that's seen, the view. And we have to be mindful that it's impossible to distinguish any idea, identify a relationship, or arrange parts and wholes of a system without taking a perspective. There's always a perspective involved. So I'm aware of the time. I'm going to skip through one of these examples and get to culture. Is that all right, Dana?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. So I'm going to skip through this, but just think about a pond and how interesting a pond is, all the distinctions, systems, relationships, perspectives that you can make about a pond. And basically, when you're thinking about any simple idea or any idea, if you ask one of these, these 4 questions: what are the distinctions I'm making to frame it? What are its parts? Are there relationships among the parts I'm not seeing? Are there different perspectives I could take to better understand the idea? That's what we mean when we say train people to think in order to learn, to have those kinds of questions in their mind as they're trying to understand something. Evolving our mental models is what I spoke about earlier, where we're going constantly through that feedback loop. And that when we go through it more and more, we're better aligning our mental models with reality. So let's talk about culture a little bit. And as a member of an organization, as the learning function, you need to think about what are the things you're purposefully doing to support organizational learning. How do people inside of an organization share their learning with the organization? And how could we use technology or other tools to facilitate that learning so that we can distribute that knowledge across the organization? You don't want all the organizational knowledge to sit in one spot. You want it to be distributed so that everybody is learning from every other thing. We'll move through that. Remember, I told you we need to focus on the relationships, meaning that our vision, mission, capacity, and learnings are all lining up. And let's talk about culture. So that was VMCL sort of in the fast track. Culture is at the base of VMCL. We need to share the mental models that we have about vision, mission, capacity, and learning to drive our organizational behavior. And what's important is that most people think of culture as sort of amorphous. It's intangible, treated as sort of mysterious. But the question is, can we purposefully build a culture? And if we get clear on what we mean by culture, we can actually build it and change it. So you have employees and customers coming and going in and outside of your organization, but there's always a culture in your organization that persists. And where culture is concerned, success is due to the sharing and diffusion of mental models. And if you can harness your culture, then you can harness the power of this VMCL model, so that you don't end up with just a few well-written statements and a couple of maps as a proxy for your culture. And culture is what happens when people possess they have the same mental models about things that matter. And this is the contrast to just sharing information like a memo or a document, meaning you have to actually build the same mental models. So culture is the crux of VMCL, and VMCL is the crux of culture. So those things interact very powerfully. And let's just sum it up here, where you have systems thinking is DSRP that teaches us how we build, share, and evolve mental models. We know that individual learning happens when we change a mental model. Organizational learning happens when we have a change in a mental model that's shared across the agents in an organization, and that culture is comprised of all of those shared mental models. So it's developing an awareness of and willingness to challenge mental models that facilitates the individual learning that drives organizational learning and all the way up to vision. So we got to build a culture of systems thinkers that drive learning to improve capacity to do your mission, and then you'll get your vision. And that's it in a nutshell, in 53 minutes instead of 45. But,
okay, that's good. That's good. We scheduled this till 11:30 just so that we have ample time for questions. And if we finish earlier, we finish earlier. But during your presentation, I moved everybody to panelists. So what I'm going to do is, if Laura, you'll stop sharing, and if you need to share something later, we can pop it back up. But that way we can put everybody.
Look at all the faces.
Yeah, everybody on the screen, which I like better.
Yeah, it's nice.
Okay. Well, Laura, that was really wonderful. And the thing that I do like about it is each piece that you covered about an organization, whether it was mission, vision, or the culture, it's defined simply instead of with a lot of words. So, and I think that makes a big difference, to think about culture as a mental model. That says it all, really. So who has a question for Laura? Sue, I think you had your hand up like at the beginning of the presentation, and I didn't know if you had a question or not. And everybody's on mute, so you'll have to unmute yourself. And if you have problems, I'll be glad to unmute you, but then we go back and forth muting and unmuting each other. So.
Actually, the hand was accidental.
Okay. I thought maybe it was. Did you have a question though?
I have lots of thoughts running around in my head.
Okay, well, we'll let you settle those down a little bit and you can come back.
I guess I'll say one thing. Flock, not clock. I love that. That's lovely. And I want to adapt it when we think about successful organizations, or I would say, instead of not clock, I would say clocks that support flocking, and there's clockwork that supports flocking, and there's clockwork that inhibits it. So I just kind of, thanks.
Interesting. I like that. It's an interesting concept.
Marcus, did you have your hand up? Okay, just unmute yourself.
All right. Yeah, thank you for sharing. Wonderful opportunity to hear all this stuff. When I listen to you, Laura, I sensed I work with clients, engineers, for example, and how do you respond people who are not into the whole thing of systems thinking? What are your experience to create a learning realm, so to say, that people easily step into from the linear world, let's say, to the systemic world? What could be helpful interventions that people feel drawn to this kind of thinking? And what is your experience?
You mean, what is the experience of how are you drawn from away from sort of linear and binary to a different way of thinking?
Right.
Yeah, I think it happens a couple of ways. I think first, some people are drawn towards a different way of thinking because they're not happy with the results they're getting and whatever they're doing. So that's sort of the natural way. I also think as things are becoming, I think, more connected, more complex, as organizations have far more to deal with internally and externally, I think there's a need for both simplicity and a grounding in reality. And I think the two of those combine is what leads us to looking for simple rules that really function naturally inside of an organization, so that the resistance that we're getting is not from within ourselves, but from the things we have to try to deal with or solve. Me personally, I will tell you, I don't know, I will tell you that growing up, I was an A student. I was a linear, linguistic, typical student, never thought of myself as visual or systemic, didn't know what systems thinking was, had no idea that I could actually, with very little effort, retrain the way that I think about things and learn to be visual and not just linguistic, and learn to sort of challenge the way that I was thinking about things, the way that I had sort of traditionally been taught, successfully been taught. So I do think it's possible. I don't think we often realize how pliable our minds are, even as we get older. They're still pliable, and it's just a matter of sort of the motivation and the impetus to do it, to really try to challenge our own ways of thinking. I'm not sure if that answered your question. But.
Thanks, Laura. Very helpful.
Oh,
Thanks
good.
Thank you, Marcus. Scott Mooring is next.
Oh, yes. Oh, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so the question is, if you're in an organization that hasn't heard of VMCL before, it sounds like you're recommending that you start with the vision, which sounds like a logical, linear way to go. But I'm wondering if it wouldn't be helpful for someone who doesn't, maybe their vision is completely unclear, and perhaps they have to look at the artifacts around them to say, what is it that we really are doing? Because we right now have the leadership vision, and then we have the middle management vision, and then we have this group's vision and all that sort of thing. And I'm just wondering if that would be productive to try to get everyone together and try to make sense of that, as opposed to saying, what are we actually doing right now? Quick side story, the easiest example of that I have is that my college campus has an oval, they call it, and it's the main center with all the original buildings. And they didn't actually put the sidewalks down to start with. They just left it. Yeah. And then all of the paths that people took wore their way through the grass, and then they were able to say, this is where we need to put the sidewalks. So that's kind of an example of which way you could come at it from both ways. So I'm curious what your experience on that is.
Yeah, I actually love that concept of the college campus, because the most beautiful section and the oldest section of Cornell has these concrete paths, and then it has it has footpaths that don't match with the concrete paths. So if they had taken that approach, it would have worked much better. But to your question about the vision and having a vision at the top level and sort of the middle level and other levels, there are a couple of ways to think about that. So the first thing is, it is possible. The first thing is, if those three visions are working against each other, then you have to purposefully articulate each one and work to create an integrated vision that is shared across those levels in the organization to have a singular sort of direction. But there are also other types of organizations, for example, some school districts that we worked with many, many years ago, where it was possible to have the district's vision, the school district's vision, but within different divisions inside of the school district, they would have their own vision for their division that actually nested and connected into the larger vision, so that even though their vision was articulated a little bit differently, it was still in concert with the overall direction that that organization was going. So in other words, it's okay to have variations in the vision statements if they're all in connection with each other leading to one place. It's when they're working against each other that you have to purposefully articulate, get those mental models out, pull and pick at them, and then come up with one that's shared across the organization. That's where I'd start. And it's nice to meet you, by the way.
Thank you.
I've
Thank you.
seen your name. I saw a poster that was really cool. So it's good to meet you.
Thank you very much. Yeah,
Yes.
that was terrific. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Brian Dowling is next.
Hello. Well, my question was, you mentioned before about mental models were information plus thinking. And I was wondering, what about emotion?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, the way I would answer that is, I think that, you know, we talk a lot about systems thinking, and we think a lot about cognition and the difference between cognition and emotion and other things. And I think when you think about systems thinking, emotion is sort of one piece. There's emotion, cognition, and causation. And when you think about a mental model is information and thinking, I think emotion is, let me think about this differently. So you can think systemically about anything, and you can also, you can think about when you're feeling something as the result of a thought, right? A mental model is something that you think, and that thought is what leads to the emotion. So we can deconstruct that thought to help better understand the emotions that we're having at the time that we're having them. In other words, you have to kind of separate them a little bit and understand that a thought precedes an emotion. I don't think about the emotion as part of the mental model as I do a result of a mental model. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. And it has some implications about how you're going to push forward on the mission, because people could have different emotional reactions to it. And you have to take that into account.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And you have to be very careful to sort of think about what the possible reactions are to shifts in mental models, shifts in mission or vision among the people in your organization. And you have to be transparent about that. And you have to deal with it. And the way to deal with that is to go back to the originating mental model that's causing that feeling.
I've been looking at two different areas, systems thinking and asset-based community development. And it seems to me that asset-based community development is more tied in with the emotions of who they're trying to deal with, but at a more street level. And I've been trying to figure out how to bridge these two disciplines together. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Great. I have a comment from Jean Bellinger that I'm going to share. And Jean, if you want to expand on that, please unmute yourself and feel free to. But he just provided the Heath brothers claim that the logical thinker is the rider on the emotional elephant. So I thought that was pretty visual. Jean, did you want to say anything else about that?
Well, I could get myself in trouble.
I know you do.
That's all right.
The idea being that we are primarily emotional beings, and that the way that they've positioned this in the book, which I can't recall the title of, was that you look at things logically, but the extent to which you manage to control yourself logically is minuscule in comparison to the way that you're emotionally driven. And it's appropriate to understand the difference between them. Otherwise, you deceive yourself into thinking that logic is going to take you where you want to go if you're not paying attention to the way that your emotions are also driving you.
Yes, yeah. So are you, but logic isn't quite the same as, it's not the same as the mental model or the cognition. I mean, I think what you're getting at is that the mental model precedes the emotion. And if we're careful to know how we're thinking about things and how that's maybe causing an emotional response, it's not necessarily logic that's going to get rid of the emotion, but understanding and deconstructing the mental model that preceded it.
Typically when we construct our own perspective of our mental models, we tend to think about it from a thinking perspective as opposed to an emotional perspective. We don't include thoughts about our own emotions in the construction of our own mental models, so that we deceive ourselves into believing that the mental models that we create about ourselves and our actions are in fact logical and truthful, though our own greatest skill is our ability to deceive ourselves into believing almost anything.
Yeah.
Right?
There is that.
Yes, I understand that point. Yes, I understand. But that's why we have to think, systemically about our emotions as much as anything, right?
That would help.
Yeah, we have to think through those things in the same sort of algorithm that we do other things. And it's not until you're through the emotion that you can go back and think that back through. You can think through it, which would then hopefully help us change our patterns of whatever behavior we're not liking or emotions that are negative or affecting us.
Takes a lot of deep breathing and self-awareness.
Yes,
Yeah.
especially these days. Takes a lot of extra effort in the world of COVID. Yeah. And that's the whole point of metacognition, right? Is to be aware of how we're thinking about things, which then allows us to also be metacognitive about how we're feeling and why we're feeling the ways we are, so that we can learn more about that and sort of stave off those patterns that we find destructive to our own lives.
Okay, good. Thank you, Jane, for the comment and discussion. The next person on the list is Rajneesh, and then Eve, I see you raising your hand, and you're right after Rajneesh. Is that okay? All right, good. Rajneesh.
Thanks, Diana. Hi, Laura. I'm Rajneesh Chaudhary. I am a management consultant and researcher, been very interested in critical systems thinking for a while now. I have read a recent paper by yourself where you talk about the fourth wave in systems thinking. I was just wondering to explore with you, how does DSRP relate to the fourth wave of systems thinking, and the approach that you have laid out for the vision, mission, and culture of an organization aligns with the fourth wave, and on what's really different from thinking critically? Because to me, we are again talking about boundaries into relationships and emergence. And how is the fourth wave and how is what you're saying so different from critical systems thinking, which is a third wave as you defined? Thanks.
No, it's a great question. Very timely. So I think of the fourth. So when I think about the fourth wave, right now I'm working to as an editor for the Routledge Handbook on Systems Thinking, and one of the biggest questions about that is, what is the fourth wave? And so I've been thinking about it a lot. And we really think about the fourth wave as being about the universality that sort of underlies the methodological pluralism from the third wave. So what are the things that are that underlie all of the different methods and approaches that we think of as systems thinking? Meaning, are there even simpler elements underneath all of those methods that are common across systems thinking? And so we think about that as metacognition, what it means to be aware of how you're thinking things through, how you're applying all of these different methods and approaches. So really, to me, the fourth wave is about seeking that, so sort of universal foundations, rather than, because we have a lot of fantastic methods and tools in the field of systems thinking. And now the question is, what is it that is common across all of them that we can really sort of distill what systems thinking is, so that we can even get better at teaching it? Because to me, I'm motivated by literally creating 7 billion systems thinkers. Even if I could just create one in the White House, I would have a huge effect on this world. The waves are sort of characterized by, first we talked about sort of physical, then we went into social and critical, and now we're moving into sort of universal in terms of the field. And that would be what I would think of as the fourth wave.
Great.
Rajneesh, did that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you, Laura. I mean, I've recently started talking about systems thinking as a state of mind, which really takes you beyond frameworks and methodologies.
Yes.
I've recently come up with a concept of holistic flexibility, and so just glad and excited to see the alignment that we're talking. Thank you. Thanks, Dan.
Totally agree with that. I think that's a great way to think about it.
Great. Okay, Eve, I believe you had a comment. There you go.
Yeah, I mean, in listening to the discussion about thinking and emotion, I mean, I think, you know, there is some research and literature out there that's helpful in looking at the multiple layers and levels of that, because it seems like there are multiple levels. So the cognitive scientists and cognitive psychologists have distinguished what they call system 1 and system 2. Both relevant to thinking. System 2 being the more logical level, which can be linear or cannot be, you know, can be more systemic in the way you're talking about it, but that is the more conscious, aware, articulate nature of thinking. But then that lies on top of system 1, which is more associational. That's the level of metaphor. Lakoff and Johnson have, you know, talked about that. And the kinds of associations people make that they're not always consciously aware of. And a lot of what we call culture lies at that level. And it does tend to be linked to what people experience as emotion. But, you know, as far as emotion goes, I think techniques for becoming more aware of emotion and also harnessing it, because sometimes emotional reactions to things can give you more systemic wisdom than level 2 can. So the techniques like focusing, where people focus on the which is considered distinct from emotion, you know, physical reactions in your body, and just being able to notice those. So there's techniques for doing that. And that, again, I think, you know, can be a vehicle for systemic wisdom. And the arts in general, I think, are helpful in supporting systemic wisdom, and counteracting some of the more linear versions of level 2. So I think that's worth thinking about and harnessing as well. Writers like Bowman and Deal, who've talked about organizations and organizational development. So they talk about a symbolic dimension of organizations that links to what a lot of people call organizational culture, but it also links to that more like level 1 associational realm, and to the power of you know, ritual and the arts to link to, you know, as I said, kinds of systemic wisdom. I mean, they can also push people in very dysfunctional directions.
Yeah.
But so that's, I think, an important thing to think about if you're trying to think about and work with building organizational culture.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think if you think about system 1 and system 2, you think about system 2 is really where metacognition lives, and that in a weird way, when I was talking about DSRP, which are the distinctions, systems, relationships, and perspectives, in a lot of ways, those operate in a way to frame what's happening in system 1. So I think that system 1 and system 2 are useful, and I think that it's a good piece of research. But I think that there's a connection between what we call systems thinking, metacognition, and those two systems. And that, you know, when you really think about, I mean, we get this question a lot about emotion, and I think what we have to remember is sort of emotion and conation and cognition are all sort of occurring together. They're not existing separately. They're all intertwined in all kinds of ways. And so, you know, we need to remember that underlying all of those things are these 4 things that we're doing to bring meaning into concepts. You know, we're drawing boundaries, we're making connections, we're taking perspectives when we're mulling through anything that we're thinking about, regardless of which system we're in, and all of those. Oh, you're muted.
Eve, you're muted. Eve, you're muted.
I was saying you're talking about the feedback loops that exist between those different realms.
Yeah.
And I think it's also important to think about the kinds of technologies, and I don't mean that in a sort of techie hardware way, but you know, the kinds of methods that we have for dealing with those feedback loops. And you know, and like I said, don't discount the arts, because I think they are an important way of accessing and integrating those different levels.
Yes, I agree with that. Definitely.
Thank you, Eve. Scott, do you want to ask your question? And then Allison, I'll go to you after Scott. Do you want me to ask it, or do you want to ask it?
Oh, it was just a comment that I was putting out, that as I'm reflecting on some training that I've done previously, I'm thinking that I know we can think about our thinking logically, things that we've already thought about. We can think about things we want to do, planning, thinking about the future. But in the moment, I wonder if we can actually be logical, and that's perhaps what Jean was suggesting, is that it's like riding on the back of that elephant. You think that you're acting logically, but the elephant's actually directing where you're going. And so that's kind of integrating what I think Laura was saying, which is, yes, we need to think about our emotions. But I wonder if because what I was taught a while ago is that when you're in a highly charged emotional state, good or bad, your logic is kind of suppressed. And so, but that happens right literally this moment. And then now I can think about what I just said, which is now fading into the past. I can think about that logically. And I can also think, that's how I've reacted before. That's how the group has reacted before. So now when I'm thinking in the future, logically, I can try to take those things into account. It's just when I'm right in the moment, pulling yourself out of that emotional control and trying to think logically, I think is perhaps the conundrum. So anyway, it was just a comment. There's not really a question there.
Okay.
No, I think it's interesting. I think sometimes we use logic and thinking interchangeably or synonymously, and I think they're slightly different. I think, you know, there are different forms of logic. You know, there's many different, and there's a certain set of componentry to logical thinking. But I think when we generalize out from that and make the distinction between them, that you know, that thinking sort of is a little bit of a foundational piece, that logic is a certain way of thinking,
okay,
but not thinking writ large. So like binary versus multivalent forms of logic are very different. And I guess when I think about sort of DSRP and systems thinking, you know, we know we can predict whether you're being binary or multivalent, that you're going to look for relationships between and among things. We can predict that you're going to draw boundaries. We can predict that maybe a different perspective on one person's logic will change that logic. And so I would sort of push back a little bit on that and think about it.
So yeah, what you explained, what I think is perfect there is thinking does not equal logic, or not just simply logic, that it encompasses the emotional. And I think that's the part that I was tripping up on. So expanding my definition of what is thinking, well, someone I think in the chat had said something about when you are making a distinction, that can be an emotional distinction. Well, okay, that's part of making a distinction. It includes the emotion. Okay, thank you.
Gold star, definitely.
Thank you, Scott. We're going to go to Allison, and then next, Scott Jackson, you can ask your question as soon as Allison finishes.
Yes, thank you. So this is somewhat similar to this thread of discussion, but it's more explicit about how do you describe the work on implicit bias, because there's a lot of that going on right now about people trying to learn more about it. And I make my own connections among these, but I would really appreciate how you be thinking about including what do you do about implicit bias? Because a lot of the things about that are just like you have it, they're blind spots. And then, so if you have anything to add, I'd really appreciate hearing.
Yeah, actually, we've also been thinking about that a lot. One of the things that is happening at Cornell University with all of our faculty is we're really being challenged to look at our own implicit and maybe unfortunately explicit bias in our own teaching, and not just our teaching, but our, you know, our course materials, the cases we use, all of those things. And, you know, one of the reasons that we teach systems thinking at the graduate level to policy students is that it's incredibly important in any arena, but especially in the policy political realm, for policy makers, decision makers, to be aware of their own bias and how that plays out into codification and legislation and policies, which then has an effect on groups. And what we know from boundary making distinctions is that when we set an identity, there is always an other. And it's the awareness of that other that is how we start to get rid of bias. It's when we don't recognize who we're marginalizing, when we don't recognize the relationships we're not making or the perspectives we're not taking, that bias runs rampant and bias becomes indoctrinated, codified, whatever word you want to say. So I actually, in a fairly simplistic way, when we teach, I think of DSRP systems thinking as the antidote to bias. That it's a way that when we're aware of how we're thinking, how we're building mental models, actually aware of them, and aware at the elemental level of the boundaries I'm making and the possible unintended consequences of those, that we're going to teach people how to recognize and get rid of those things, which is what needs to happen, obviously.
Laura, I think you're right. And I think just talking about distinction, I mean, that's like a key door opener to being able to get to that bias that we all have. So thank you.
Yeah, and it's perspectives too.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
Not recognizing those perspectives. I mean, it's all of it, but
Yeah.
the
Scott,
boundary is the original problem.
yeah. Scott Jackson?
Yeah, I'm really happy that Allison brought up the question about bias. And I'm assuming what is generally known in the literature is known as cognitive bias. I believe that's the same thing. And there's been a lot written on it. As you may know, two gentlemen won a Nobel Prize for thinking about cognitive bias. One of them is Daniel Kahneman, and the other one is Richard Thaler. And basically, they agreed that it's something that everybody has, and the problem with it is that very few people know they have it, and very few people have the capability of eliminating that bias or dealing with it, unless it's a very simple bias. And I wanted to bring up if you look cognitive bias on the internet, you will find a list of about 100 or so of them, and there's one in the organizational context I believe is more important than all the rest. It's called the rankism, and it's the bias I have not only read about in the literature but also have experienced myself in the organization. And what rankism is, it's the belief by the person at the top. Whenever you have a hierarchical organization, the person at the top always believes that he or she is superior, not just in authority, but also in knowledge. And this has been addressed, but I would say it's not been addressed very much. Now, the Columbia, it's been a root cause of a lot of major accidents, including the Columbia accident, and they presented a solution. Their solution was to have in the organization, not in the organization, but really outside the organization, an independent authority, somebody who sees the problem from a distance and can provide some expertise. So I'm wondering if you have thought about rankism and whether or not you see any solutions to it. I think, my personal opinion, it's a really major problem.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think there are two ways to think about it from sort of an organizational perspective. I mean, the first thing is one of the points of VMCL is that first you have to accept that the organizational culture is comprised of shared mental models. When you accept that as a fact, one of the mental models that you have to make sure is shared if you're purposefully trying to work against rankism as an issue, is that all people in the organization will be treated with a certain amount of value, dignity, whatever the word is that you want to use. And that you have to indoctrinate that. You have to make that one of the critical mental models that you want shared across your organization to build a culture that respects that actually purposely works against that phenomenon, which can arise very normally among humans. The second thing that's important about VMCL that I didn't talk about is that VMCL is a model that is meant to align and integrate across an organization, but it also is a fractal, which means that just like we can have visions in divisions, a division can have a different vision that feeds into a larger vision. Any level or any scale of work inside of an organization can have its own VMCL. A project can have a VMCL, a division can have a VMCL, and the organization can have a VMCL. An individual can have their own VMCL. So what that means is it empowers every agent within that system to set forth its own vision, its own daily work, and to build their own capacity to get to their goal state. And because it's fractal, it means that there's less of that top-down mentality. VMCL creates an organization that's far more networked and adaptive and actually sees every single agent in that system as equally valuable to getting to that end state. In a school district, whether it's, the people who come and clean the building all the way to the superintendent, every person in that organization is directly connected to the vision of the large organization, which means they have equal standing in many ways. They're valued very differently. They're seen as an integral part of reaching a vision. And that also, I think, works against that kind of a bias.
Can I suggest one rule to add to your list? There's a book I got it out of. The rule is called defer to expertise. I think that's a wonderful rule.
Defer to expertise?
Yeah. In other words, if you're the top of the organization, and I think it's fair to say that most executives don't know how to design airplanes, but Boeing executives seem to think they can do it. And so the rule they need to follow is look down into your organization and understand who knows best about the subject and let them make the decisions.
So are you saying seek other forms of expertise outside of what you believe? Like you're saying with the Columbia, they look to an independent outside authority to fight against that sort of rankism that you were talking about.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Yes.
You're not saying like within an organization defer to that person at the top. You're saying that all experts should seek other experts, like
that's
outside.
good. That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one way to check your bias for sure. Is to get an outside, perspective on what you consider to be your own expertise for sure.
Great. Thank you, Scott. We're down to the bottom of the last 30 minutes. So everybody that's registered will get a link to the video. And also I'll put the chat box in there because there's a lot of good references in the chat box. And I just want to thank everybody for attending. And Laura, thank you so much for the presentation. It was wonderful, as I expected it would be. And we'll look forward to, I think you've got a new article coming out, maybe?
Yes, I think the answer is usually yes. Yes, we have articles, we have the handbook coming out, we have another book we're writing.
Well, you have an article though on the leadership piece, right?
I do actually. I'm happy to share that. I have an article which I think I shared with you. I'm happy to share with the group.
Okay. I didn't know if that could be shared yet. I'll be glad to do that. Okay, great. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Nice to meet everybody. Stay safe. Stay healthy.
Yeah. Stay safe. Laura, if you want to stay on.
Sure.
Yeah.
And thanks for moderating, Diana.
Sure, sure, I love it.